Okay, now for something completely different. Anybody know who this is? Raise your hand, raise your hand. She wrote all the Apollo code. This is the inventor of computer science back in the days when hardware engineering was a big thing, software engineering was thought as an afterthought. This is Margot Hamilton in front of the lunar lander module of Apollo 11. And she introduced concepts like quality assurance and error handling and asynchronous software, human-in-the-loop decision capacity. There she is, in the loop. And here's her documentation. Luckily for Margaret and for celestial bodies everywhere, the dot matrix printer was invented a few years prior, so typing that out by hand must have been quite an arduous task. And this also resembles MSDN's documentation from about 5 years ago. And here is this lunar lander module that the astronauts, I don't know if some of you can see, reaction control system controls. Oops, sorry. Stay in the box. Reaction control system controls. Talk about anxiety in labeling when you use the word controls twice in one section of this panel. And for those of you to notice the well-worn yellow bar at the top, which is the holy shit, we're going to crash into the moon control. So this is what she was documenting now, and it's responsible for all of the processes and software engineering that would go into putting a man on the moon. And as many of you know, this was released. Apollo 11 landed 47 years ago last Wednesday. So how does that fit into this? If the developer is the astronaut, the gentleman that's strapped to the chair, I will be the person that is strapping them to the chair. I'm making sure your head is comfortable, making sure that the straps aren't too tight, that you clamp your hands together in a forward official manner, because I am not a developer. I'm a designer. If I were to describe what I would have done 50 years ago if my grandfather had the same position as me, it would be the guy that's making sure everything's okay. And as you launch to the moon, as you go into orbit, we can look back at those human factors and make sure your skull does not compress. There. Okay. So given that my development, my shooting of the stars is still in its infancy, we approach this as a research project. We wanted to have conversations with the product managers, the developer evangelists, the ones that were responsible for generating and managing the documentation, as well as on the right side, the developers who were responsible for consuming, both upstream and downstream. So when the good folks at Heavybit wanted to collaborate on this talk, I said, well, let's reach out to 2 dozen different representatives, and we'll do this as a compilation of results that we've found. User research. And so here are our illustrious 16, some of whom you might recognize here in this very room, some of whom might be very close to you at companies that you work for. Here's some of the companies that they used to work for or currently do. And as the conversations went on, I gave them complete anonymity. You don't have to talk about any company that you work for or used to work for. You can just leave it completely open. So, without further ado, the good, the bad, and the fugly. This one is going to be a highlight, low-light reel to get us started to sort of wet our beak a little bit on this user documentation and the different opinions around it. So this could be a little bit scattered, and then the conversations hit about 4 or 5 different points over the course of the 30 minutes, and then wound its way into a couple different interesting areas that I'll bring up as we go.
Documentation is a pretty strange thing in that at a really early stage, you're so interested in building the product that you're not really focused on the docs. And so they get slapped on at the very end.
It's sort of like this recursive loop of, to understand this, go to here. I find myself bouncing back and forth and not really getting any concrete answers a lot of the time.
At the very top level, they're like pimping marketing shit, and it's like I can't get past that and actually find where the documentation is about their service.
There's like a Python that is like actual Python, and then there's a Python that's like future Python 3000 or something. And they're not the same language. So anytime you search for anything,
Right.
you find some collection of stuff where it's like,
Yeah. As we saw a lot of talks about versioning and how to do things, that some of those points have rung true already. One thing I want to talk about is the organization and the process. As being introduced to Heavybit and some of the incubator companies here, a lot of the times the CEO, the founder, the technical lead is the one that's writing the documentation. How do they set the standards so as the company grows, documentation is an integral part of every cycle? One of the concerns was with continuous integration or agile or very quick sprints, documentation always gets left to the last thing that you're supposed to do. It's not a ticket that is imperative, but before you move it to the right, that the documentation's done. And so I implore you to make sure that documentation is done prior to the release. When we asked different interviewees who's doing it better, Stripe kept coming up again and again and again because I've heard that Stripe starts with the documentation. Is that right? Yeah, they start with the documentation. It's a conversation in between members of different teams, whether it be marketing and product and engineering. It's the way that we describe the value of this feature. We're going to describe it internally and then take something from an ideation in an internal wiki and start to transition it into something that's more public-facing. So documentation that translates from conversations intermix teams is going to lead to something better down the road. And there was always this hesitancy about one department or the other speaking different languages or the different technical levels and capacity, but that doesn't mean that developers can't communicate well with one another. Usability and efficiency. So these are some quick hit things that you probably already know about, but pre-populate token keys versus all caps, insert underscore token underscore key. Yeah, that thing, if they've already logged in, you should know their token key, so take it and then put it right in there so they can copy and paste and not have to go and retype it themselves. We heard about cookieing the dev language of choice. If you know they're a Python developer, cookie that and make sure that every time they come to your documentation site, it remembers that they're Python versus JS versus Node, whatever it is. And then, easier said than done, connect the sandbox to the account. There was a gentleman from Twilio here that talked about the hello world time. It's because it feels like you're in a live account and you can make calls from the documentation on the browser itself. That prevents somebody from having to jump between terminal and browser, which is always a very jaunting user experience. And for fuck's sake, people, don't use PDFs. All right, so versioning. With the gentleman that talked about Python 3000, I thought really talked about it well, is that if there's something going on with your product, if you're pivoting, give it a different name, because it's going to make such a mess when somebody's searching and going into the wrong place because they're using the same product name for one and the other. The deprecated calls to make sure that there's a nice, healthy flag to say, hey, it used to be this and now it's this, and offer replacements around that. And then deprioritization of older versions. So if somebody's on your site and using an internal search engine, of which I'll get to on the next slide, make sure that they're able to isolate. I only want to be able to search on the current version of the calls. I don't want to search everything, just show me what's recent. And the last one, sorry about being so ambiguous about this one, but have a strategy, whether it be redirects, whether it be alias, make sure that the SEO, because none of us are going to do search better than Google. They've proven that there's a business model there. And external indexing does not cure all. I'm not going to speak about the employer, but a former employer of mine said, well, Google's bringing us all of our traffic. You know, why should we invest in search? Because everybody's coming from Google anyways, right? We see the inbound traffic. We see the directs. We could just leave search alone. I think that's a bit of a misnomer, because you've got a captive audience that's coming to a result, and you know who they are and you know what they're looking for. And so it's not easy to just say, oh, well, you know, they're coming from Google, so we don't have to do search well. You know where they are, and even what they're searching for would suggest that they're a beginner, they're looking for maybe hello worlds or use cases or something very simple, or if they're looking for a very low-level API call, they're more advanced, and that they're going to want a different set of content around that. So show related items in content sections and tag everything. But just because Google's doing it better than you doesn't mean that you're off the hook. Community. This is the part where I introduce documentation as a platform, where, in the great words of one of my participants, the first thing that they look for is not the documentation. The first thing they look for is the community to answer the question that they have.
If you're going to have documentation about how it works, you have to have some central source of truth. I don't feel comfortable with the idea about having the official core documentation get muddled with potential pieces of misinformation, FUD, or varying voices in there. Some people will write in the first person, others write in the third person. It just kind of makes for a very hard to distill and hard to digest set of documentation.
I wanted to be one of the top contributors on the Heroku tag on Stack Overflow. That was just important to me. What it told me was that I was out there listening to the problems that people had, and kind of was on top of what were the pitfalls of using Heroku.
I would say don't touch it for a day. Let other community members chime in, because what I found was as soon as the company comes in with a verified company account, it would kind of kill the thread, or at least it made it less inviting to other people to participate.
How many people agree with that last point? Let it sit for a day on Stack Overflow versus chiming in? One versus the other. He was speaking about a consumer product. He was speaking, I won't name it too, but one of the frustrations that I've heard is that I don't know where to go for the answers. I've asked the question. Anybody know what the difference between documentation and support is? It's about 10 seconds. where you don't know where to go, and the first thing that you are going to go to is Stack Overflow and watch people come answer the question for you. And if you are there and if you are active, you're setting the tone of the conversation. You're showing that your company is responsive. You're showing that you're going to where the developers are asking the questions versus waiting for them to come to you. It's a very proactive approach. And again, extending these values of responsiveness, of care, of really generating the conversation. But I heard one of the interesting points was a guy went through, the same one about the Python 3000 quote, he went through a 1,000-page Stack Overflow question and answer, and the one that was the final point was written by the guy who wrote the README. And he said, but he never linked it back. So take these, whatever you do, with a central source of truth, encourage and foster these external conversations, but always link back to the reference point in which you're developing. Always link back to that README file, that documentation in which you want to have that answer. Easier said than done, I know, it's hard to upkeep. But if that's where the developer goes, then follow. So something unexpected happened during our conversations, and lucky enough, it was the first conversation that I had when a gentleman from Ireland gave me this quote, that the error messages are the unsung heroes of documentation, because whenever somebody hits one, you can educate them on how to do it better. And I walked in the middle of the product discovery panel, and I saw they started talking about errors, and I'm glad that they scooped me a little bit, because I think errors it's a catalyst for documentation. If you have any small children like I do, the first thing they do when they get a toy is rip open the box and start playing with the toy. They don't go and look at the manual and read it, okay, and I'm going to start to sort of make sure I understand everything before I start to see if it breaks. And if you've driven with me, you know that maps are a thing of the past. I'd rather go into the brick wall first and then know that that was not the right turn to Albuquerque. So I think the same thing's true with developers, is that they want to start playing with the product. That's our goal, right? Get them on board, get them activated as fast as possible, and let them hit the first error. How do we treat that as an extension of documentation? Okay, we know that verbose error messages are important. How about putting in shortcode links to whatever page on the documentation site that explanation can be a bit further? There's an interesting concept from a gentleman that used to work for Heroku about the transparency of the occurrence of the error messages. Is this an edge case that I'm hitting? Is this something that nobody ever comes upon, or does everybody hit this message? And therefore, I'll feel a little bit different about it. To sort of showcase metrics and numbers publicly so that they know to which level these errors are occurring. And I thought also, just even the notion of when you develop site-based navigation, site-based content around your pages, is to show what errors might be able to occur. And I don't know if that's something that is it's exposing of a weakness. If you use this, you might expect errors like this if you're not doing that. It tends to be all put into one page, and here's a numerical list of the error codes, and you can just look that up, as opposed to taking those and portioning them and associating with the calls that you might occur. So I think that is it's a form of fundamental movement of how we should start to incorporate errors into documentation and really illustrate, here are some of the things you can go wrong, versus cordoning them off. And for those of you who stay in the command line, make sure that your error messages are even within help, are not a scrollable output, to make sure that they're concise and well organized, because again, the jump between terminal and browser is a long one. Metrics. Ultimately, documentation is driving some kind of action or behavior. It's like downloading or building an app. It's really hard. And the point to engage this one on is, if you're lucky enough to have open source your documentation, as that lady from the now new MSDN has done so, is to make sure that GitHub is a constant repository that is a nice, easy metric to understand what's fresh. How are people using your products? Microsoft is doing something wonderful in the sense that anybody that's contributing to their documentation, they put up as a top banner of, these are the people that are helping this thing live. And if you're looking for metrics, some low-hanging fruit are the number of pull requests and comments and events, and the inbound traffic from Stack Overflow. I've got a bit of a horror story from a former employer. One of the things that we saw was somebody that was wanting to help us with our documentation, and they submitted a pull request on a page, and it took us 7 weeks to merge it. And when we did so without comments or thanks or any sort of recognition. And the guy snarked us and said, look, I'm out of the goodness of my heart, I'm trying to help you improve things for other people, and you just fold it right in without any sort of, you fold it right in after 2 months without any sort of acknowledgement. Don't be that person. Be the one that owns the metric. You heard about the guy who wants to be the one on Stack Overflow that was the foremost authority on whatever product he was working for. Be the same one that owns these different metrics and tracking the number of items, and start to create evangelists from the ones that are starting to help you improve your documentation. quarterly conversions. And these last two slides are fairly similar, but again, they go into the platform aspect a little bit. And we talked about the time in between when their account is created, when these marketing pages have created a registry account for them, and how long that takes. What's the delta between that and the hello world? What are these conversion percentages? So these are as much of an infrastructure questions as they are a design or a layout. You've got to talk between registry and marketing and then funnel into Salesforce to understand what type of calls that they have. How quickly can you get to activation? And I'd even raise the question is, does the documentation even help or hurt? If you want them to go in and start to figure out, don't lose them in documentation pages. So this is where you get to be data scientists and start to play with the numbers a little bit about where you direct people after account creation. And then lastly, when do API calls indicate a near launch? Will you pay attention to the API calls and how they begin to accelerate? You want to get developers out of the sandbox. Yes, we're talking about activation and conversion and get them going as fast as possible, but paying attention to which pages do people tend to hit as they start to go ramp up to production. So, how am I doing on time? I wanted to say thanks. Good luck with your launch. I hope that the Margot Hamilton at your company will design the dashboard as nicely as they did for the Apollo 11. And that's it.